So first of all, I would like to thank the whole team to organize this conference. It's basically a very, very good idea to try to gather people to have interesting speeches and thoughts about regulatory approaches and tools to meet the decarbonization challenge. So, well, first of all, I would like to welcome you all to this conference. As you know, we have in Europe now a lot of work, a lot of ongoing work on the next legislative package, Fit for 55, with several revised European texts to be adopted in the course of 2021. The goal is to reduce emissions, CO2 emissions at the European Union level by at least 55% by 2030. So this is obviously a huge commitment from Europe. If you see longer term, we see that the climate neutrality by 2050 is now a goal shared at the European level. If I speak a bit about what France here, this is also a goal that is now officially set by public authorities in France, climate neutrality in 2050. Also, obviously, a lot of countries, Europe, obviously, but around the world, a lot of companies too. So very, very important. So just for France, we have some strategies that have already been adopted. National low carbon strategy, the PPE, which is the multi-annual energy programming. So we have now in front of the Parliament the future Climate and Resilience Act, which is now in discussion. Anyway, what is very, very important to see that this challenge, this decarbonization challenge, involves all sectors of our economies, whether they are regulated or not. So a few words about the energy sector, which is the sector I'm involved in, especially electricity and gas. So I would say that the main challenges for electricity and gas, I would say there are four of them. First of all, obviously, decarbonization of the power mix. That's for sure, with a lot of gas and coal, etc. Existing. I would say that, well, in France, it's already the case. Sorry for that. The power mix is already decarbonized. Second challenge, very important, it's the electrification of the economy, and particularly transportation and heating, which are obviously big CO2 emitters. So one way to go forward is to electrify these sectors. The third challenge is another one is the decrease of the use of natural gas, with development of green gases, obviously, but also some tricky questions of potential sunk costs in gas infrastructure. So a problem for regulators. And the last one is probably the creation of a brand new economy, brand new economic activities around hydrogen. Well, obviously, the four challenges, they can only be met by taking the most out of the process of digitization of our societies, of our economies, knowing that the communication and information sector itself is a major stake regarding its energy usage and carbon footprint. But beyond information and communication, all sectors are involved. That's the important point. So we have a few challenges regarding especially regulators, which are how to foster major investments needed in frequently regulated industries, which means enabling funding for these investments, but also guaranteeing efficiency of choices and a fair distribution of costs among the various stakeholders. You have the issue of the writing off of past investments. You also have the conflictive objective of guaranteeing moderate price evolution to the users. It's very important. But also funding the investment and giving the right signals. For instance, we will see in Europe very fast increase of the CO2 price. So this morning it was 44 euros. It was 7 euros 3 years ago and 21 years ago. But this is good because the CO2 has a price and this price must increase. But for end users, the electricity price, it's kind of very difficult to admit. and also well, the necessity to incite users to adopt more responsible behaviors, but not only with price increases. So all of these are very difficult challenges for regulators, and I'm very happy that we will discuss them today. I won't elaborate much around CRE and the energy sector, just only one single word, because it's very, very recent. CRE had just completed its first selection of innovative projects in the new regulatory sandbox that was set by the Energy and Climate Law in France a year ago. So we have had 41 projects, some of them very, very interesting, with strategic items like battery storage access to network and markets, V2G, vehicle to grid, metering and access rules, condition to a better use of data from smart meters. We also had some project around the injection of synthetic gas in gas networks, etc., etc. So we selected 9 of these projects, which will be exempted from certain legal provision for a period of 4 years. So that was just a few weeks ago, so I think it was interesting to mention. So that's the end of my speech. So we will have now the conference will be introduced by 2 keynote speeches, and I will just go towards introducing this this very distinguished speaker. So the first one will be Simone Borghesi. He's director of the Florence School of Regulation, Climate at the European University Institute, Secretary General of the Policy Outreach Committee of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, and also full professor of economics at the University of Siena. And the second keynote will be Patrice Geoffron. He's director of the Center of Geopolitics of Energy and Raw Materials and professor of economics at Dauphine-PSL University. So, Simone, the floor is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dominique. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And the title of my presentation will be the EU ETS at the Crossroads, Life and Challenges of a Decarbonization Instrument, with life written in capital letters, because I will build my presentation on the European Life Teachers project that I'm currently directing at the European University Institute. For this purpose, just to give a brief overview, I will start by looking at the past and present of the EU ETS, the European Emission Trading System, describing it as a living creature, so to speak. Then we'll look at the future, the open issues and next challenges ahead of us. And in doing this, I will focus mainly on the international dimension of the EU ETS and on the regulatory modifications that we might undergo and their implications. So, as you know, the EU ETS is a carbon pricing mechanism that puts a price on greenhouse gas emissions to cost effectively control and possibly eliminate emissions in the future. And more precisely, it's a cap and trade mechanism in which the government sets the cap, the quantity, the total number of emission allowances, and then the trade between supply and demand determines the price. The system has become increasingly stringent over time because the cap, the quantity, falls progressively more and more by a linear reduction factor that has been increased over time. It is considered the cornerstone of the EU climate policy, as it covers more than 10,000 heavy energy using installations, mainly power sectors and industrial plants, and around 40% of the European greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the more I study the EU ETS, the more I see it as a living creature. Indeed, as a living creature, the EU ETS comes to life, grows, learns and teaches, sometimes gets married, sometimes gets divorced. In the case of the EU ETS, it got married, it linked to the Swiss one, and got divorced from UK because of Brexit. As to its birth, we all know it was born in 2005 as the first transboundary cap and trade system and the world's largest carbon market, a record that has been preserved at least until now, until this year when the Chinese ETS should become operational. It start immediately growing, adding new sectors like petrochemical, aluminium and ammonia, and additional gases like nitrous oxide and perfluorocarbons. And while doing this, I would say it learned. And in a way, it was a continuous learning process, which is witnessed by the high number of reforms and directives it went through. Here I mentioned some of them, from the initial 2003 EU directive that set up the EU ETS down to up to the next June review this year. But not only learned, it has been also teaching to the others, because the EU ETS has been considered a pioneer and a prototype for all the other ETSs that followed. Although I would say they engage in a sort of mutual learning process. Indeed, as this diagram taken from ICAP shows, the ETS have been growing and expanding worldwide. This diagram shows the ETSs in force that are represented in blue, in green those under development, and in yellow those under consideration. And as you see, starting from Europe, the ETSs expanded to the eastern coast of America, to the western coast, California, Mexico, to Asian countries, including South Korea, to New Zealand, and now to China, that is planned to become operational in the second half of this year. All in all, ETSs are covering 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions right now. The Life Digital project that I mentioned at the beginning wants to harmonize these different systems, because every system has its own features. And so the idea is harmonizing, aligning this system in view of a possible common carbon market in the future. And the goal is so to support European and member state policymakers in deepening international cooperation with the other carbon markets. And in doing this, we have the active participation of the regulators from Europe, California, China, New Zealand, Quebec, and Switzerland. So basically the largest ETSs around. Every ETS has its own ups and downs, which are here represented by the price fluctuations. Take, for instance, the European one. The price of the European allowances collapsed because of the 2007-8 crisis and remained very low for a long while, below 5 euros per ton of CO2, up to 2018, when the announcement of the reform, especially the market stability reserve, increased the credibility and the stringency then of the system, leading to the record levels, which are now actually beyond 40 euros per ton of CO2. And a similar trend appears for the other ETSs. They all suffer from the financial crisis, demand and prices being low, and they recover from 2017 or 18 to record levels. And here you see New Zealand, South Korea in green, California and Quebec with just one line because they're linked their own ETSs, and the Swiss case that is converging rapidly to the European price because they link their system. They got married, as I was saying before, from the beginning of 2020. If you look at the right-hand side of this diagram, so the most recent observations, you notice that there are large price differences still between the various ETSs. And the price differential is even larger if you consider the Chinese pilot ETSs that range basically between 11 euros per ton of CO2 and only 2 euros per ton of CO2. So a long way still to go to create an harmonization, at least in price terms. So far, I talked about the past and the present, but what about the future? What are the next challenges? I decided to pick 3 challenges that in my view are particularly relevant, especially I hope for this audience, among the several ones that you might think of. The extension to new sectors, the possible reform of the market stability reserve, and the issue of carbon leakage. Starting from the first. As you know, as I said, the ETS covers around 40% of EU greenhouse gas emissions. So what about the others? What about its complement, the 60%? There are many other sectors that are not involved, and the Commission is planning to extend the ETS to other sectors. And a good candidate appears the maritime sector. It's rather small in terms of emissions, 3.7% of total EU CO2 emissions and 13% of EU transport emissions, but is projected to grow by up to 50% between now and 2050, which makes it a very interesting and important candidate in a future perspective. But other sectors are being considered, and there is a heated debate on whether building and road transport should also be included. In my view, we should be careful because of the remarkable impact that this might have on low-income households and commuters who are more vulnerable to price increases in these sectors. So this is not to say that we should not do anything or should not consider the possibility of having under the UTS, but I think we should redistribute a substantial share of the revenues raised through the UTS auctions if we want to extend the UTS to these sectors. And a possible way to proceed could be to set up a separate UTS for building and transport during the transition phase towards their inclusion later on in the current UTS. So in a way, two different UTSs, but that tend to converge. And the German case could represent an interesting case study for this purpose. As you know, in Germany, they set up a new ETS for fuel combustion, which is not regulated under the UTS right now, setting a fixed price of 25 euros per ton of CO2 this year, which is bound to rise to 55 in 2025, and then leading to a possible price corridor between 55 and 65 euros per ton from 26 onwards. The second challenge that I see concerns the Market Stability Reserve. The Market Stability Reserve is an automatic adjustment mechanism to address the oversupply of allowances. Basically, when the oversupply exceeds a given threshold level, the Commission withdraws allowances from the market to support price. When the oversupply falls below a threshold, it injects back these allowances. Now, the question is, can this mechanism shelter in an effective way the UTS from the side effects of other policies or from unanticipated shocks like the one that we are living now? The answer, if we look at the recent observations, the answer seems to be yes. Indeed, the MSR reduced the surplus, contributed to support prices, and increased their resilience to shocks like the pandemic one. However, if we look into the future, we may wonder whether it will manage to ensure the stability of a higher prices that we need if we want to achieve climate neutrality, because these prices will keep increasing. And the question so is, will the system be sufficiently resilient to multiple stress tests? Because there is not only the decarbonization process, but there are also overlapping national policies and now COVID. And in this regard, I think one concern comes from the fact that the MSR operates with a minimum 1 year delay with respect to the shock. So there is a lag in the response, which could be problematic in the future. So for this reason, I think we should try to reinforce and anticipate the mechanism, because this would ensure market stability, it would increase the regulatory certainty, it would reinforce the signal to the market. And this is, in my view, particularly important given the crucial importance of expectations on carbon markets. Indeed, we have seen that prices increase before COVID due to the anticipated effect of the Market Stability Reserve. So they start increasing even before the Market Stability Reserve enter into force. And the price did not fall as much as we expected during the lockdown because of the anticipated higher ambition targets the announced and probably credible policies announced by the Commission. So expectations play a key role, and having regulatory certainty and good signal is extremely important. Finally, I would like to focus on carbon leakage. As you know, any unilateral policy may provoke carbon leakage, namely the delocalization of political activities that flee away, that move to other jurisdictions. So far, there is little evidence of carbon leakage, so it seems to be rather reassuring. But so far, the prices were pretty low, as we saw before. So the question is evident: will carbon leakage be an issue for the future when carbon prices, or given that carbon prices are expected to rise to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 or 2060 in the case of China? So the question is, how can we safeguard international competitiveness in face of rising carbon prices? And in this regard, I think we have three possible routes. One is the traditional one. The standard one is providing free allowances to sectors at risk of carbon leakage. However, this way of proceeding in the past provoked windfall profits, and in any case, it may reduce the incentive to innovation. For this reason, the Commission is considering to phasing out free allowances and moving to border carbon adjustments. But in this case, new questions arise. How can we implement it? How can we design in a way that avoids trade wars and retaliation policies? Certainly, in my view, and in the view of other colleagues, we should engage international partners in a clear, frank conversation, negotiation ex ante. We should allow for exemptions for those partners that show an environmental performance that is comparable to the European one, and we should introduce this process gradually, maybe starting from single sectors and then extending the scope. Finally, another way, a last way in which we can address carbon leakage is linking, because by linking ETSs, the price converge, leading eventually to a unique carbon price, which obviously reduces, or in the case of a unique carbon price, eliminates the incentive to flee away. So it eliminates carbon leakage. But linking takes time. It requires a high level of trust, and you need time to build up that trust. So it seems to be a long-run process. So coming to the conclusions, what I would like to stress is that all the policies, both those past and those that we are desirable or that we can imagine for the future, will certainly imply trade-offs and will certainly cause winners and losers across sectors and across the population. The higher stringency that the EU is pursuing now through the European Green Deal leads and is leading to higher carbon prices. And this is good news in terms of the internalization of externalities. But obviously, we can expect a higher impact on firms and households, especially low-income ones. And so we have to take care of the possible regressive effects of our policies. However, we should not forget that higher carbon prices imply a larger incentive to innovation, especially through the EU ETS, because you avoid paying higher carbon prices if you innovate and you can sell allowances, so earn from it. It implies, or it leads to larger incentive to behavioral changes at the family, at the household level, and higher carbon prices also lead to larger auction revenues. The auction revenues under the EU ETS were more than 57 billion euros over the period 2012-2020, and 14 billion only in 2019. So if prices keep increasing as we observe and as we expect, the amount of revenues will increase accordingly. And the use of this amount is of key importance to mitigate losses and to fund the low carbon innovations that we need. 10 billions are expected to fund the innovation fund, so for innovative low carbon innovation at their starting level. And 14 billion are expected to be raised through the auctions for the modernization fund in the next decade, the fund that will help the lower income countries modernize their energy system, for instance. So the EUTS has great potentialities to help the decarbonization process, but we should be careful. We should remember that it's not a silver bullet that solves all problems. And since I describe it as a living creature, let's say we should not leave it alone, because no one wants to stand alone. We will need also other accompanying measures, other regulatory measures that come along with the EUTS, in my view. And on this, I think I can stop because of my time constraint, and happy to discuss the issue more with you.
Thank you very, very much, Simone. It was very, very fascinating, very interesting. I think the ETS, or price of carbon, is obviously the cornerstone of any serious decarbonization policy. So it's very interesting to have this as a first intervention. Now, Patrice, it's your turn. You may have to catch up a bit for the few minutes that Simone used.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see the front page of my slide.
Yes, it's fine.
Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. I'm sorry not to contribute to the gender balance of that introductory panel. I've seen in the chat that it is an issue, but the equilibrium will be organized later in the coming panels. And I will quite briefly share with you a few observations as regard that challenge of decarbonization seen from a regulatory angle. And the idea is to base that observation on some studies or some exercise of policy analysis in which I've been involved in the last months in the context of the present crisis. So 5 slides, 4 ideas, and the first one is the following: the so-called low carbon transition is in fact not just an energy challenge. As mentioned by Simone, through the ETS, the issue is to be able to lower the carbon intensity of many economic activities. But if we want to summarize the challenge based on an energy vision, in fact, it is probably too limited. Maybe that what I would like to stress up from now is obvious. Just have a look at the graph on the chart on the left part of my slide. It is quite a simple calculation that I've made, establishing the relation between CO2 emission historically and GDP. And on the left side of the chart, in fact, we don't see anything that we don't know. This is a classical and positive relation from a macroeconomic point of view between the CO2 emission and the GDP growth at the world level. But I think that the other part of the chart is more interesting because this is considering the remaining carbon budget, the CO2 that can be emitted in blue if we want to stay below 2 degrees at the end of the century, in green if we want to stay at 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. Just have a look at the green one. In fact, that one, from my point of view, is fascinating because it would mean emitting, let's say, 5 gigatons of CO2 in 2050, which is more or less tomorrow as regard infrastructure investment, meaning that this is the same level than 1 century ago in 1950. But between that 2 dates, in fact, the world population will have been multiplied by more than 3, and the world GDP, in fact, we don't know because the future is uncertain. But if we make an hypothesis of growth of 2% from now to the middle of the century, this is the result of that. and with, to summarize, the same level of CO2 emission in 2050 compared to 1 century ago, with a GDP multiplied by 10 between that two period of time. Meaning that we will need to be much more efficient in any economic area. First remark, which is, I agree, probably quite obvious. What is less obvious is that from a macroeconomic point of view, the world which is here, and especially during the present decade, is a kind of terra incognita from an macroeconomic point of view. Because in fact, behind us, we have 2 centuries of GDP growth based on growing CO2 emission, and the world that we have in front of us is supposed to be different. And we know as Europeans, because we are already on the other side of that Everest, we know in Europe that switching from the first model to the second one is something complex that takes time and so. And so first observation, in fact, doing that will mean being very innovative from a regulatory point of view, will mean being very cooperative between sectoral regulator, and maybe will suppose more and more interaction also with a financial regulator, because that world which is here will be also a world very unstable, probably from an economic financial point of view, with stranded assets. It has already been mentioned, and this is something we need to consider very carefully. And I will be brief on the other chart, which is only a way to highlight that the leverage in as regard the challenge, the CO2 abatement will suppose to activate other technologies than the one developed in the energy area. Once again, it is obvious, but the potential impact of ICT to be compared with that level of emission need to be stressed. Here, this is the same idea, just to continue to stress the point that the low carbon transition is not only an energy challenge. And I like that comparison that I use with my student. It was proposed by Nicolas Stern and Felipe Calderon in their new climate economy report. And that comparison is between Barcelona and Atlanta. At a first glance, that comparison is not obvious. But if we consider that 2 cities have the same population, more or less 5 million inhabitants, then the comparison is more relevant. And in the case of Atlanta, the urban transport area has been developed over more than 4,000 square kilometers, and only because Barcelona is an old European city, only on 162 square kilometers in Barcelona, with, as a consequence, emission related to transport and per people, which are 10 times higher in Atlanta compared to Barcelona. And then behind that, the solution will obviously not be to concentrate Atlanta in the space related to Barcelona. I'm not sure to have recommendation regarding that challenge, but it is again one way to highlight the complexity of the whole process of transformation, and to again underline the fact that many different kind of regulators will have to be involved in that evolution. Second idea, sector coupling, and that idea of sector coupling have already been mentioned since the beginning of our discussion, is not limited to gas and electricity. Being able to couple gas and electricity in the future, and especially in Europe, is a key issue, because as all of us know, It will be a way maybe to store the surplus of renewable energy in the gas network, and then it will be a way to continue to provide services and to create economic value with the gas network. But in fact, many of that sector coupling works will have to be implemented. Here, this is a study in which I'm involved related to the data center electricity and carbon footprint in some part of Europe. That study will be available in June. And here you have, both in Ireland and Denmark, the growth of the electricity consumption, which is supposed to be induced by data center in the coming decade. And for example, in the case of Ireland, and the situation is very close to, is very similar in Denmark, close to 30% of all electricity demand at the end of that decade is supposed to be induced by data center. Due a policy dedicated to attract the investment of data center, due to the fact that there is, through PPA, wind power available in both parts of two member states of Europe. But that growth is challenging because they need to be able, in fact, to integrate a new sector which will be key for the transformation of the society during that decade. But as far as I know, this is the single intensive industry which is supposed to have such a growth rate in Europe in the coming years. And then it leads to very complex issue in terms of local integration of that data center, because there is the need to contribute to electrical market flexibility, also to develop where it is possible, and most of the time this is not the case in Ireland, but it is more the case in, oh, excuse me, my slide has disappeared. Okay, I can continue. Dominique, can you confirm that?
But in any way, if you could just continue for a few minutes only, it would be fine, because we have issues with the agenda.
Okay, but do you see my slide?
Not at all.
Okay.
That is it. No, it's not.
Okay, someone else.
Annegret, it's not you. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
This is good.
I think, okay, this is good. So, second ID, and I will just close that ID. Very complex issue in terms of integration, demand response, and contribution to flexibility, and ability to be connected to fiber network also, and then a new question in terms of sector coupling. Third idea, in defining, in fine-tuning the regulation, we should not avoid in calculating the positive impact of the climate action. We should not avoid the co-benefits of the climate action, especially in terms of air quality. And unfortunately, in the future, after the health crisis, probably that issue will be even more important in the public debate in Europe. Here you have, this is a work developed by OECD as regard the cost of air pollution in Europe. And that work make the demonstration that lowering the air pollution in Europe since 2000 has contributed to the GDP growth, and in fact explain 15% of the GDP growth in Europe over this period. So CO2 price is key, the payback related to the CO2 price is key, but we need also to pay attention to over benefit of the climate action, and just have a look at that report which had been published last year, and makes an exercise of demonstration of that impact of co-benefits as regard rail activity. And last but not least, and as a conclusion, I've been involved last year in the Convention citoyenne pour le climat, the French Citizen Convention for Climate, and there are over exercise in Europe and especially in UK presently. It is key because when we have in mind the redistributive issues of the decarbonization, most of the time we pay attention to the stranded assets and to, let's say, coal power plant. But in fact, we need, and especially in Europe, because if Europe wants to be a pioneer, Europe has to deal with the ability of citizens to take direct benefit of that transition. Dominique, that's it. I hope that I've managed the time more or less efficiently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrice. Thank you very much, Simone. We don't have time left for any questions, so maybe we will come back to you after the next session, the next roundtable for a round of question answers. So I would like to introduce the next roundtable, which is about the energy sector overview. We have on stage Annegret Groebel, which is the head of Department for International Relations at BNetzA, the German regulatory authority for electricity, gas, but also telecommunication post and Huawei. She's a star amongst European regulators. She has been elected as president of the Council of European Regulators, and we speak today as so. We'll also have Martin Cave in the roundtable, which is Ofgem's chairman, the UK energy regulator. Ofgem is the mother of European energy regulators. It's still an example for the quality of its processes, its transparency, the quality of analysis, etc., etc. So, I'm very glad to welcome Martin Cave today. And also we'll have Monique Coenraad, which is a senior economist at the ACM, Authority for Control of the Market, which is the regulator for energy and other sectors in Netherlands. So thank you, all of you. The stage is yours. Annegret, you are the first.
Thanks a lot. So, Sophie, I'm starting to share the slides. Okay, thanks a lot. I will try not to cover all the 40 slides, but only the main importance. And I would like to speak here on the energy regulation to promote the energy transition. And I think this is a perfect transition from the previous speaker, who finished by saying it is important to involve and engage with European citizens. And that is also what we put on our, let's say, on our strategy as one of the main points. It seems the slides have vanished again. Yeah, here we are. So I think we can skip about this. This is just to put it in context with the Paris goals, etc., and also the Fit for 55 goal, climate target of the European Union. This is just to highlight in which, let's say, environment energy regulators work, and also to show that regulation, of course, is still based on the regulation of natural monopolies of the transport and distribution networks, but that there are a lot of new responsibilities for regulators since the liberalization of the market. Since the increased use of renewables, which is already part of the energy transition, and of course with the arrival and integration of new technologies, and in particular digitalization. So we have now the role to integrate renewables, an increasing share of renewables. As I said, this is a very important part of the energy transition, of clean energy. We have to integrate this into the grid, but also into the market. So this is a part where regulators play an important role. So we have more work there. And also coming from this, we have to facilitate the transition in the sense to make the energy system, the whole energy system, more flexible because of the renewables are more volatile. And of course, one of the elements to make this, to increase the flexibility of the whole system is to make use of digital technologies. But that requires to integrate them into the regulation with a new system, using the markets, ensuring that markets are well functioning, because otherwise it will not be possible to, with an old type utility style regulation, to achieve this flexibility of the and integration of the whole system, because we have there a much closer interaction between the different levels of the system, between generation and between the grid and between the market. So that's very important. And one of the key messages is that this needs to involve an empowered and active consumer. For example, to make use of the demand side flexibility, to buy into the system. And for this, we need to define ex ante the roles of all players, and in particular, as I said, to empower consumers. We call all this dynamic or adaptive regulation, in the sense that we try to adapt and make regulation more flexible as the system and the developments require. However, as I said, we are still based on the fundamental principles of regulation of natural monopolies, and therefore this does not mean that we forget about predictability and about fundamental principles of regulation. So all in all, we aim to have a smart regulatory oversight with a market-based, whole system, consumer-centric approach, fostering the necessary innovation. I'll quickly come to the current strategy, which we call the 3D strategy. And you see here already the digitalization for the consumer. Again, the consumer is in the focus. The decarbonization at least cost, so that relates to the Green Deal objectives, even though at that time, of course, the Green Deal was not yet born. But again, the important part is here that we say at least cost. So the regulation should contribute to integrate renewables and other measures for the energy transition at efficient cost, in an efficient way, at least cost. That, of course, is also not to overburden users or consumers. It should be done in an efficient way. And as you see, all this is based on what we call dynamic regulation. And at the center, we have consumer protection and empowerment. And that relates also to the fact that we don't want to lose the protection of consumers that we have. So I'll move on here with the next slide. Maybe it can be put to the center again. So here are some of our documents. I'll skip over this not to overrun here my time. And I will come now to one of the things where we have a concrete example of what needs to change in regulation. And that is about the network tariffs, in particular on the distribution level, to ensure that the distributed energy resources are well integrated into the grid and the markets, and give the right signals for more flexibility. So that means that, for example, tariff structures need to be further differentiated, e.g. by the time, so that you may have dynamic price contracts by location, by interruptibility, All this is a prerequisite to engage consumers in making active use of, for example, demand-side management or demand-side flexibility. Because unless you have these differentiated tariffs, demand-side flexibility will not work because consumers will not see why they should do this and engage. So that's an important point, and therefore we have some recommendations as regulators on how to integrate or introduce these new tariffs, and that is outlined here. That also involves then taking into account the storage facilities. All this again in the idea of having a whole system approach, and of course also of ensuring that the price signals work efficiently towards flexibility solutions and towards infrastructure investment where it is needed, both on the distribution level and of course transmission level. But here we are looking more at the distribution level. The point about this is that the new mixture, it's not only in investing in infrastructure, but it is making sure that the market design is built also to ensure that flexibility solutions, storage solutions, etc., which is a special form of flexibility, if you like, are working and can replace infrastructure investment. Yeah, so that's part of the change, of the mind change also that we need to have. I'll only mention this without going into detail, as what I have said so far was mainly more about the electricity market. Here we come to 3 recent white papers that are published and that look at the renewable gases and hydrogen. So of what has to change and what regulation is required and is needed to also incentivize the development that we see on the electricity side on the gas side. And of course, also to look into the insurance of what was mentioned also previously about sector coupling, etc. We recently also published a short paper on the dynamic regulation. And I would just want to highlight the main results that we have 2 sorts or 2 categories of regulatory tools to make this work. One is using, for example, with the tariffs, incentive regulation to incentivize efficiency, efficient investment, but also efficient operation of the network. So that relates a bit to the at least cost element. That is something which is a tool, a classical tool. And we have the new tools of the, let's say, experimental regulation, where we check new instruments. And Dominique was mentioning one of those already, and CEER is an example given in this paper about regulatory sandboxes. There are also others, and I assume the colleagues from ACM will talk about this, so I will stop on that. Pilot projects, pilot regulations. So again, there are instruments and we need to test it and to introduce these instruments to ensure that we are up to the development that we see and can influence it in the way that I outlined. One of the elements I want to say on this slide is when we worked on this, collecting the examples that exist already for also regulators that are only thinking about this, it became clear that this is one of the main or important elements that regulators exchange about these new tools and the experience they have, so that the learning curve is speeded up and we don't need to reinvent the wheel when we try it ourselves. So now this is about our new strategy, energy regulation, consumer-centric regulation to promote the energy transition, which is currently under consultation. And you see here all the elements that I mentioned already, and therefore, in the interest of time, I'll skip immediately here. We have 3 regulatory dimensions to reach this, enabling energy system integration. And this goes a little bit beyond the sector coupling. It goes further. We put the consumers at the center of energy markets with consumer-centric dynamic regulation. And we want to base all this by ensuring open, well-functioning and resilient markets nationally and in Europe. So here are the 3 dimensions that I just outlined. And you see on the right-hand bubble that the consumers are in the center. And there are several boxes or several areas which underpin the regulatory dimension and which contain a lot of the topics that we now need to address, but in the spirit of having this strategic approach of enabling the consumer to participate actively and thereby benefit from the energy transition. So not as a ratepayer, but as an active part of this. These are the different topics. We outlined that the new strategy will work for 4 years, 2022 to 2025, and you see here the different reasons for this. I'll don't go into details and just come to the conclusions. We see that energy regulators are having more responsibilities. And one of the mega trends, or the mega trend, in fact, driving our work is indeed the climate change. And our energy regulation must also reach and work towards a carbon neutral society and economy. So that's one, or the target under which, and that's more than what we had in the past. And we place the consumer in the center. So we have this consumer-centric dynamic regulation. As I said, the regulation should not be static, but dynamic, based on well-functioning markets. So the 2 go hand in hand. That is also important for us. And all of this means that we adapt our regulation in the sense to reach these objectives and to cope with the more flexible energy system. And working towards the energy transition. So I hope that the ideas were clear, and happy to discuss further. And I stop here. Thanks a lot for the attention.
Thank you very much, Annegret. I think that you just emphasized the major point, which is the pace of change that is going faster and faster, and regulators are adapting to that. And that's, I think, the main point. Very interesting. Martin, it's your turn. Are you here?
Okay, I'm here. For technical reasons, it's going to be sound only. So just imagine for the next few minutes you're listening to the radio. No picture, no slides. As other speakers have said, I have to begin by saying that in my view, this decarbonisation problem that regulators face is one of the most difficult ones that I've ever come across, for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, because it affects every component in the value chain, from generation of electricity right the way through to measures to influence or provide digital support for the behavior of consumers. Second, it's an enduring process with a mixture of long-term and intermediate targets for different sectors. Some of those strategies we probably know, some of them we're still struggling to identify. And then finally, it may involve new governance arrangements across legislation, policy, and regulation. And we've been greatly helped in our regulatory endeavours in the UK by the fact that in recent months, a number of publications have been issued by other bodies. For example, Parliament's Committee on Climate Change. The government's also produced a short-term 10-point plan and also a much longer-term white paper. And these are creating a context in which independent regulation can operate, because we know what the other components of the process in terms of legislation and government policy increasingly are. Now, our objective set by Parliament is very clear. is to protect the interest of current and future consumers of energy, especially vulnerable ones. And obviously, future consumers of energy in particular have a very strong and powerful incentive to decarbonisation. So we're taking that into account. And it's fair to say that the whole organisation, the whole of Ofgem, board and the staff, are fully committed to this objective. And we all desire Ofgem to play a key driving role. And that's what our endeavours are based upon at the moment. Now, that said, I just want to talk very briefly about how, as an organisation, we're progressing our decarbonisation ambition, for talking also even more briefly about our recent network price controls. And it will be clear we're just at the start of the process. We recently published a document which set out 5 strategic change programmes which exist alongside our usual regulatory functions. The first is to invest in low carbon infrastructure at all points in the value chain, including strengthen networks to connect more renewables, potentially new regulatory regimes for nuclear and carbon capture and storage, and trials to assess the potential roles of hydrogen. Then we have a programme in full chain flexibility, for example, enabling new sources of flexibility such as storage and the flexible charging of electric vehicles. We also want to enable to take advantage of innovative new retail products, whilst updating our consumer protections to ensure safeguards both for those who actually engage in the market and those who don't. And then alongside the net zero transition, we're seeing growing opportunities from data and digitalization, which is our 4th strategic program. And then finally, as the energy sector goes through this major transition, we need to ensure that energy system governance is fit for purpose, including the role that Ofgem plays. This may also involve the role of the systems operator. So we're working on those 5 strategic options, but most recently, the timetable has made it necessary for us to introduce a new price control for electricity transmission networks and gas transmission networks, and also gas distribution. And so we've taken the opportunity to insert new features into our network regulatory system in order to facilitate decarbonisation. So in our final determinations, which we published at the end of last year, the electricity transmission and gas sectors, we announced a very substantial 35 billion euro programme of upfront investment for a greener and fairer energy system. But we also allocated for the first time a further 12 billion euros of investment, which could be unlocked via uncertainty mechanisms or reopeners to support net zero. And indeed, we've said we will not limit spending for green energy if it can be justified. Further, we have made 750 million euros available via a strategic investment fund, a network innovation allowance, money that can be used, for example, to fund hydrogen trials in gas networks. We've also decided at the same time to reduce the amount paid to shareholders so that they're closer to current market levels. This, as you can imagine, is a fairly controversial part of the process, which is currently under appeal. Now, finally, I'd just like to say something about COP26. We are hosting the COP26 conference in Glasgow in November, and we're chairing it with our Italian colleagues. And at Ofgem, we are keen to work very closely with other regulators and organisations to maximise this opportunity. So please get in touch with us if you want to engage us on our plans. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Martin. Well, very, very fascinating. So, and you kept the schedule fine. So thank you very much. I go now to Monique Coenraad and Elisa Kahl. Sorry, Elisa, I just forgot to mention your name. I was through my notes too quickly. So, well, obviously, everybody knows that the Netherlands is the country of gas for many, many decades in Europe. So, very, very interesting to hear from you on the decarbonization challenge and the special issue of going away from gas, because maybe the next challenge. Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I was having connectivity issues, so I didn't hear you missing my name, but I know it now. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present on the Dutch approach, the Dutch case study to the regulatory challenge posed by decarbonization. Setting the scene Yeah, next slide. I'll start with a quick look at the background against which our case plays. And indeed, we are the country of gas, so that's one of the main things I'm going to say there. I'll quickly present the key challenges from the Dutch energy transition for the regulation of networks. And then Monique will go into what we actually did, what the research was that we did, what conclusions we came to, and how we will apply this in the Dutch regulation. Next slide. Next slide. So a bit of background. Indeed, we are a country of gas. So in the 50s and 60s, we found enormous quantities of gas, and networks were rolled out throughout the Netherlands. So most households in the Netherlands are dependent on gas for their heating, which means that if we want to decarbonize, we need to get away from gas. And that's a major challenge because everybody is connected to gas, and that's how they get their heat. Next, just to give you an idea, we have a very extensive gas network. So you see pipes running from the northeast, where the Groningen field is, all over the country, and also to neighboring countries. And this is only the transmission network. So the regional networks look, of course, even more meshed. But one interesting aspect you can see here is that we have a network that is rolled out double. So there's a lot of parallel pipelines because we have low calorific and high calorific gas. And that is something that poses a quite unique opportunity for things such as hydrogen. So you could actually disconnect pipes from the methane network and use them for hydrogen because we have parallel networks. Then a quick glance at our regulation. So what we do is we have incentive regulation, which means that we set the income level for 3 to 5 years, and then it's set. So no adjustments, bar some specific ones, but largely the income level is set. We set it based on expected efficient costs, and those efficient costs are largely based on past costs. So that's something very interesting in the energy transition, because everything is going to change. And we set tariffs then equal to the income level divided by expected book capacity. So the expected book capacity is another very important component in our regulation. And then this poses the challenge that can we still use those past data on costs and on capacity to estimate future costs and volumes, or will that no longer work? And then for gas and electricity, it's actually the issues are the same, but the other way around. So we risk overestimating costs and book capacity for gas, but we risk underestimating costs and capacity for electricity. And now specifically for gas, we did some major research on this in the past few years, and that's something Monique will take you through.
Thank you. So as Elisa just mentioned, gas played a huge role in the Netherlands as an energy source, much larger than in other countries. In the future, due to the closing of the Groningen field and transition to greener energy sources, it will play a much smaller role. However, it will remain uncertain what role exactly is. That's why we decided to investigate the impact of the declining use of the network on the regulation. For example, we investigated, will there be stranded assets? Will there be increase in tariffs? How much will this tariff increase be? We investigated by looking into previous research on this topic. There is a lot of previous research for the Netherlands in how to reform our heating. And then we came to possible scenarios. And from there, we concluded what effects there would be if we didn't make any changes to the regulation. We did this in cooperation with the DSOs and the TSO in order for us not to fight about the numbers. and also they have more knowledge about the market and the energy sources than we have. So we use that knowledge in order to conclude our model. We have made we came to 3 scenarios, and these scenarios are 3 possible realistic future who all meet the goals as set in the climate deal of Paris. Each of these scenarios has a specific focus, but in all scenarios, all energy sources are used. The first one, the solar, wind and heating, has a focus on electrification of the as an energy source. The second one is green gas, has a focus on green gas as the main heating source. And the final scenario has a focus on hydrogen as the main heating source. Then we see, for ranging from the scenarios, a decline in the use of gas, and then we mean methane, from 49 ranging to 36%. Yes. Then we looked into what does this mean? And what we see is that there's evidently a declining use of gas, so there will evidently be a declining use of the gas network. This can lead to increasing cost per booked capacity, and the network operators also have to make investments in order to facilitate green gas and hydrogen, especially especially the DSOs. So our distribution system operators will also have to remove entire parts of their network. The TSO will probably have the same network but use it in a less manner, but the DSOs will probably have to remove whole areas. And these also come at a cost. These cost changes and these lower capacity leads to tariff increases. Also, it raises a question of cross-subsidization between users now and users in the future. So the consumers who are now on the network, some of them will leave in the future, but the ones who left also cost the cost that only consumers in the future will pay. In the following slides, I have a few graphs on what would happen if we did not change anything to the regulatory method. So we would remain using the historical basis at a cost to estimate the cost for the future. Now, you can see there is a lot of decline in required capacity, but there is no scenario in which there will be no use of the gas network at all. You can see the same for DSO and for TSO. Here you can see the investments you have to make. You see that the investments for the solar, wind and heat scenario are similar to the green gas scenario, and that's because in both these scenarios, the gas network would mainly be used as a peak demand facilitator. You see in the blue line, that's you have the most investments for hydrogen. They will start a little bit later, and that's because the hydrogen techniques are still very much in development. You can see the same picture for the TSO. Then for the DSO, here you have the cost of removing the network. And you can see that in the hydrogen case, they would have to remove the least. You would still have to remove quite a lot when you go to green gas. And that's because there is not much green gas available. So it's not a very sustainable solution, if you will. Now, what does this do with the tariffs? You can see quite an increase, ranging from a factor 1.3 to 2.8 in 2050. where electrification, we have the least use of the network, so we have the highest increase. You can see the same almost for the TSOs, but for green gas, they have to do more. They have to do more investments as a peak demand, so that's why this is the largest increaser. And you have a little bit less increase because the network will be used a little bit more. Then, as to the question of cost-reflective tariffs, network users that remain on the network also pay for costs that are caused by the network users that already left the network. And this is a form of cross-subsidization between now and future users, because the customers that left the network should actually also pay for the cost that they cost. That's a lot of same sounds. But after they left the network, you cannot charge them anything anymore. So that is a problem. Then we get to the conclusions and solutions for the Dutch regulation. As mentioned earlier, there is a decline in the required network capacity, but in all scenarios, there is still use of the network. And that means that there are still network users who can recover the costs. And that means that there are really no stranded assets. And we mentioned the word sector-wide because we have some smaller DSOs, and theoretically, that can be DSOs that have to remove their whole network, and those assets will strand, but we find that unlikely. We do see that the tariffs increase. For us, that's not really a problem because the EU regulation specifically states that tariffs should be based on the efficient costs. And as long as that's the case, for the NRA, it's not really a problem. However, for policymakers, this might be different. So we did mention this to our policymaker who has internalized the information. And finally, as I said before, there is a cross-subsidization because the remaining network users also pay for costs triggered by network users leaving the system. And that means that we find that costs should be more divided on a more fairly mannered over time. Then we get to how we adapt the regulation. We focus mainly on dividing the cost more equally over time, but we found it a very difficult dilemma. There are still many uncertainties on when we're all going to be off the gas, and how fast, how much, will there be hydrogen, will there be green gas? So you have a trade-off of doing too little too late or too much too soon. We wanted to do something now because now we have still a lot of users on the network, but we decided to act conservatively. And we also looked differently at the DSOs and the TSOs, but that's because of subtle differences in their regulation system. We took 3 measures. We changed from a nominal WACC to, from a real WACC, weighted average cost of capital, to a nominal WACC. And this means that inflation isn't paid, is no longer postponed over time, and users pay immediately for this inflation. And that is a part of dividing the costs differently. And secondly, we removed the divestments from the asset base. In the past, they remained part of the asset base, so network operators could earn back their investment. And now network operations still earn back their investments, but by depreciating the divestments at once. And finally, the most important change I find is that we changed to a digressive depreciation method. and that means that we depreciate asset more in the beginning of the asset lives, because in the beginning of the asset lives there are more network users. For the last one, we have to determine how fast, how much we accelerate the depreciation, and we have to determine acceleration factor. We decided to do that by looking at the average of the scenarios and matching the depreciation with the usage of the network. Again, we wanted to be very conservative, so we started slow, and we can always adapt the acceleration factor the next period, so we can lower it or we can either accelerate even faster. Well, looking at the average and matching the depreciation with the usage pattern of the network, we came to 1.3 for TSO and 1.2 for DSO. And in case of the TSO, he might, as Elisa just explained, use part of the network for hydrogen. And that means that those assets will still be in use and redeployed. So in order to prevent cross-subsidization between the natural gas network users and the hydrogen network users, we excluded those assets from digressive depreciation. So that was a measures we took in the Dutch case, and I would be happy if we have some time to take any questions.
Thank you very much to both of you, Monique and Elisa. Very, very fascinating topic, and it's not frequent to see a study up to 2050 with at the end some concrete and real decision taken after such a study. So right now from you, thank you. So just I will take the first question from me. Sorry, one is quite interested. Is that your study, is it available in English on your website? And the second one is also about the Dutch state maybe has committed on net zero 2050, I guess. But I see that you still have at least 50% use of natural gas. So is it compatible with the net zero future?
The first one, unfortunately, our study is not available in English on the website. As to the second one, we do still use the network in scenarios, but all scenarios are compatible because we took into account carbon capture storage as a method to still go to zero.
Yeah, and in some scenarios, the gas that goes through the network is either hydrogen or green gas, so that's also a component.
Okay, I have another question from the audience, which lets me have a look, which is regarding, I think that the CO2. The question is, well, what's the EU strategy for countries that do not really care much about CO2 emissions? Because we know that exists. So I think it relates to the question of CO2 leakage, and which is, just to mention, I think it's question, CO2 leakage is a question of international competitiveness, true, but it's also a question of global CO2 emissions, because sometimes you can replace activities in Europe which are quite CO2 efficient with the same activities elsewhere, which are much less efficient. So in this way, you increase CO2 emissions. So why do you have somebody, maybe Simone, I don't know, or Annegret, I don't know, or do you have answer on that, the EU strategy regarding CO2 leakage, carbon leakage?
Well, I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think the usual way to deal with it would be to have this cross-border carbon tax. That is what is being discussed. If you refer carbon leakage to the international situation, if the carbon leakage is meant in a technical way, I'm not the expert, so that's the economist answer.
I think it's a linkage to other areas in the world.
Yeah, exactly. So then I think the what is being discussed is about the carbon tax or CO2 tax or whatever you call leakage tax, whatever you call it. And I also answered to one of the questions. For this to work, of course, you need a taxonomy and an international standard to speak of the same thing, and to also have an understanding of how much CO2 emissions you are talking of for particular types of gas, for example, or of hydrogen. Also, hydrogen is not per se carbon neutral. Yeah, it's meant only for the green, so-called green hydrogen. So there must also be a taxonomy about the colors for hydrogen, for example, to have a system that works cross-border. I think that's important. As long as I have the floor, can I ask one question to Elisa or Monique?
Please, Annegret.
Yeah, thank you. Just want to know, as of when do the new decisions about the changes that you explained apply? Is this for the regulatory period already, for the current regulatory period, or for the next one?
For the one from 2022 to 2026.
Okay, thanks.
So the method decision for the gas TSO was already taken in February, and we are going to publish on Monday the draft decisions for the DSOs and the electricity TSO.
Okay.
For 2022 onwards, for 5 years until 26.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe Simone, if you would add some ideas regarding the question of carbon leakage and the EU strategy.
So sorry, I was struggling with the with the video and the microphone too, and I'm afraid I lost the question. I couldn't read it, but I heard it. So if I heard it correctly, what Annegret was saying is absolutely true. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is the main way in which we, as European, aim at addressing the problem. I think we need to do our homework very well to convince the other that this is not a protectionist measure. So we have to be careful in the use of the CBAM, because if that is the case, if it is perceived in the wrong way, then it could somehow destroy the negotiations that we are leading and have negative feedback effects on this creation of a climate club, so to speak. But having said that, the criterion is right. We need to safeguard the competitiveness of our industries as compared to other jurisdictions that have lower prices or no prices, because I was showing the ETSs around the world, but there are just a few in the end as compared to the whole number of jurisdictions. So this is a big issue that as an economist can be addressed theoretically, empirically. It's part of my job, but from the political side, it requires a gradual and process, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Simone. Well, last question for me regarding energy consumer. I've heard about the customer-centric regulation, active consumers, etc. But we see that all these transformations are very expensive. A lot of network investment. You see the case of gas, obviously, a lot of costs. Sorry, this man. And you see also the price of CO2. So we see in just a parallel growth increase in the price of electricity that came from 40 euros 2 years ago to more than 55. So I don't know, maybe Annegret or Martin, what are your thoughts on that? How can this transformation not be too difficult for consumers, because they may be active? That can save them some costs, but their bill will probably increase.
I think that's a very good point, and one of the answers is, of course, as was also mentioned by ICM, to only, for example, in the network charges and other charges, pass on efficient costs. And I think that was a very good element described by Monique and Elisa, to also consider that this is a gradual process and an intergenerational process. So to spread out the costs not only to the current generation, but also to the future generation, because the future generation will profit even more if the climate change is stopped and if the target of a carbon neutral society is mentioned. So therefore it is right, according to the principle of cost causality, to say then also the future consumers should participate and should bear costs, and not only the current generation. So I think that is one element which reduces then the bill for the current generation. And I think the other element that we should not forget is that currently the benefits of the lower costs of renewable generation, which you see on the wholesale level, because prices on the wholesale level decreased dramatically, is not fully passed on yet to the retail level. And I think that is an element where we still need to think on how can we ensure a mechanism that passes on, so more competition probably, that passes on the reduced wholesale level, wholesale price level to the consumers. Yeah, so there is the pass-through is interrupted. Yeah, and that is something where the benefits of the of using more renewables has not yet arrived on the consumer's bill. Yeah, they only see they only have the hard part, but the benefits is not yet arrived. And that is a structural problem. That is not only something by adjusting your behavior according to consumer to dynamic prices, etc. That is a structural problem between wholesale and retail level. And the last one I think is important as well, and that is addressed in the clean energy package, that the subsidies for renewables need to be efficient as well. Basically, that boils down to say, let's not make the same mistakes now, for example, for the green gas transition, in having static feed-in tariffs, but having, for example, auctioning, tendering mechanisms to ensure that the costs of the subsidies are adjusted continually when renewables become more competitive. Yeah, so that is an element in order to also reduce costs to an efficient level, which then, of course, has to be passed on to consumers. I think we shouldn't give the impression that this is a zero-sum game. Yeah, so I think there is a cost involved, but it should only be the efficient costs, and we should use all the different instruments that I mentioned, to ensure that the consumers pay only a fair amount of this transition.
What we were thinking about at ACM as well, and we don't have the answer yet, and of course it's also up to the policymaker, but what I think should be taken into account as well is that in any case for gas, it's different for electricity, but for gas, the alternatives to gas are much more expensive, right, than just staying connected to gas. So that's also something to take into account, because it's actually, gas is the cheapest option. And you can play, of course, with the tariffication of gas in order to maybe try to seduce customers to go to heat pumps and isolate their houses, etc. So that's a whole new ballgame in and of itself, I think. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, let's thank you very, very much for this roundtable. It was very interesting, all of you. So thanks very much, and we will go move to the next roundtable, which is well, basically all the sectors on energy overview. So we'll have speakers who will present other sectors such as transport, water, telecommunication. So let's introduce them. So Wei Shiuen from the International Transport Forum, or OECD. So she's advisor on sustainable transport and global outreach in the International Transport Forum at the OECD. So this will be our first speaker in this next roundtable. Then we have John Evans, who is Director of Strategy and Economics at ComReg. ComReg is the Irish communication regulator. And then we'll have Nisarg Hirani, which is General Manager for Transformation at Scottish Water. So we have a full range of different sectors. And so I'll just give the floor to Wei Shiuen.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for your introduction. And thank you very much to the organizers who have given me this opportunity to share some of our work in the transport sector in decarbonizing transport. So in my presentation today, I will give a brief overview of some of the trends that we're seeing, and also some of the solutions in terms of the regulatory framework and some of the effective measures that have been implemented in different parts of the world. So first of all, the ITF, the International Transport Forum, is an intergovernmental organization. We are administratively part of the OECD, but we are politically independent, which means we have a lot more member countries than the OECD. Many of our member countries are emerging economies, which means we do address a wide range of priorities. And in the case of our decarbonizing transport work, we do work with many emerging economies as well. And so some of the policy insights that I'll be sharing today will reflect both of the OECD and non-OECD member countries. And in the transport sector, it has been widely recognized that we are not on track. The sector itself is not on track to achieve the climate goals that have been identified. And even when we look at higher ambition policies, as you can see from the figure, we're still not looking at net zero. And in fact, as part of the Paris Agreement, within the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, only 10% of the submitted NDCs have set a target for transport CO2 reduction. And at the ITF, we've done some modeling framework and policy scenarios, and based on our projections, we will be looking at an over 60% increase in CO2 emissions in the transport sector by 2050. And if we actually implement more ambitious policies today, we could actually reduce the emissions by 30%, but then that is still not net zero. And one of the key insights that we have found in our modeling framework is the importance of disruptive innovations, which I will touch upon a little more in other slides. And as you can also see from the graph, there are different sectors contributing different shares of CO2 emissions within the transport sector. So the dark blue bars refer to urban passenger transport, which you can see that there will be a decreasing share in this specific subsector, but we will be seeing an increase in non-urban passenger transport. And this, in fact, is a reflection of the type of regulations that are currently in place to regulate urban passenger transport. So there are a lot more policies that have been implemented currently that would actually lead to a decrease in its share of CO2 emissions. And similarly, when we look at freight, this is also an increasing growing sector contributing to CO2 emissions. And we do need more effective measures in this sector for freight in order to regulate CO2 emissions. And if we look at freight specifically and break it down by modes, we can see that it is possible to actually reduce global emissions from the freight sector in 2050 by 45% relative to the current emission scenario if we have the right measures implemented. And the majority of emissions reductions will come from road and maritime freight transport. And there is, in fact, still a lot of potential to decarbonize the maritime sector, which is contributing a significant share of CO2 emissions. And looking at global passenger demand, this figure will in fact triple by 2050, with Asia, specifically China and India, generating most of the global passenger kilometers. So in terms of demand, we will also be looking at a decrease in the share from OECD countries. So on a global level, developing countries or emerging countries will actually take over the share of OECD countries, and in other words, the gap between developing and developed countries will start to narrow by 2050. And again, non-urban road will have the largest mode share by 2050. And again, this is just to show what are some of the modes within urban passenger transport. It will still be a very car-dominated sector, unfortunately, but in non-OECD countries, there will be a larger share in public transport, which is reflected by the lighter green bars. And there will also be an increase in shared mobility. In our models, we have found that it will be, in fact, one of the fastest growing modes. And this will then imply changes in some of the transport regulations that are currently in place. And so some of the policy scenarios that we have included in our analysis include those that are more specific to urban regulations. So car access restrictions, for example, which will imply changes in zoning in cities. And of course, pricing, not just on car use, but also on parking, congestion, and even road tolls. And of course, at the same time, we do need to make sure that there are enough public transport development and improvement in order to provide high quality, affordable, and safe transport alternatives. And on a system level, there will also need to be a stronger integration, a more robust integration between transport and land use planning. And of course, urban density might also change, and that will also include the improvements in accessibility. And some of the measures on the right side on the slide are more on a macro level. So carbon pricing, which we have heard earlier in the opening panel, and of course, changes in the efficiency of the system itself. So logistics, urban logistics, as well as the overall efficiency of the energy supply chain and electrification. And the ITF, we have developed a decarbonizing transport initiative in 2016, right after the Paris Agreement was signed. And one of the outputs from this initiative includes a catalog of effective CO2 mitigation measures, which I will go into a little bit more detail. So we have, in fact, developed a catalog of measures for policymakers to show where, what are some of the areas, what are some of the measures that have been shown to be effective, and to really help countries or cities get to where we need to go. As I have shown in my previous slides, there's still a large gap between getting to net zero or carbon neutral and the current situation. And even with more ambitious policies, the transport sector is still not on the right track. And so this is, in fact, an interactive tool that actually shows the different types of objectives that would need to be achieved across different subsectors within the transport sector in order to decarbonize transport. And so there are 5 main groups of measures that we have identified. So the first includes the shift to more alternative modes and to cleaner transport, as well as demand management. And the second is to improve design, operations, and efficiency. And of course, looking at the kind of modes, the more effective or efficient modes that will need to be used in different parts of the world. And of course, low zero emission vehicles or vessels in terms of maritime will also need to be better designed, and a switch in the fuel type would also need to be considered. So this is an area where the energy and transport sector will have overlapping areas and incentives. And as a whole, there will also need to be a greater integration, so between land use and transport planning, and also across different sectors. We will need to push for greater collaboration across all sectors in order to really decarbonize the economy. And the fifth area is upscaling and innovation. So we are actually seeing a merge of technology and transport for the first time in history. So really looking at some of the new emerging mobility services, such as app-based services, and how big data or blockchain, for example, could really help shift the sector to a more sustainable future. And so in this specific tool, we have identified different types of measures. It's actually based on a very extensive literature review. And it's also a tool that we hope will facilitate dialogue on transport, on decarbonizing transport across our stakeholder groups. And the scope of the catalog include different regions, so urban, national, international, regional, and supra-regional, and of course the different types of measures. So regulatory is just one type of measures, but we've also included fiscal and changes in infrastructure, technology, research and development, education, and as well as the more operational and management related measures. And this tool actually cuts across all modes of transport, which we hope will actually provide more insights in decarbonizing the sector through different modes as well. And so I have actually highlighted some specific regulations that will be relevant to this panel, to this session today. And I will not go into the details, but as you can see, there are urban, international, and national regulations that will need to be implemented in order to decarbonize the sector. And of course, each category will actually have different challenges in terms of implementing the specific measures. And we have heard a lot about the dynamic, the changes in regulations in the previous sector on energy. And this, in fact, apply to the energy sector, to the transport sector as well. There will be a need to actually improve how regulatory reviews are being conducted. And so this is very specific to some of the emerging mobility services that we're seeing, that the governance of such services are not quick enough to regulate them in a beneficial way. And so one of the policy insights that we have developed is that the transport systems will benefit from policy frameworks that foster innovation. But at the same time, we need to have the right type of regulations and to shift from a static regulation framework to more frequent reviews in order to not over-regulate, but at the same time allow new mobility services to benefit the society in general and also contribute to the decarbonizing goal of the sector as a whole. And so I do have some other policy sites in here, but I know that I'm running out of time. So
yes.
I will end here, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Weishen. Thanks very much. So John, the floor is yours.
I just maybe start off by just mentioning that this is a relatively new area for telecommunications regulators. A number of agencies, well, at least in Europe, telecommunications agencies, have done some work in the area. For example, you could call out RCEP in France and Traficom in Finland, and a number of notable others. But in the main, this is kind of early days for telecommunications regulators. This topic. I would say from a sustainability point of view, the significance of the sector has probably become a bit more apparent in recent times. As you know, as the digital economy grows, there's been a focus, for example, on the role of data centers, and that was mentioned by a previous speaker earlier this morning. It's not strictly a telecoms issue, but it's certainly a related kind of adjacent market, part of the ecosystem of telecommunications. Another area concerns kind of short life cycles of devices such as mobile phones, for example. And then this COVID experience that we're all continuing to live through, and the enabling technologies that we're relying on at the moment to do, for example, this remote conference, the role that connectivity and telecommunications, electronic communications generally facilitate in remote activities, reducing the need to travel and so on. And all this has kind of a wider sustainability issues or implications for the economy. What I'm going to cover over the next couple of minutes at a very high level is just a quick summary of some of the work that ComReg has been doing in this area, and then an indication of what BEREC. BEREC is for those who don't know, is the European organization which made up of your national European telecommunications regulators. Okay. So back in 2019, it seems like many years ago now, ComReg, we initiated this work stream, and the objective of it was to explore the relationship between the sector and climate change, to understand two things essentially: what role does the electronic communication sector have as an enabling sector, and second, what role does electronic communications have to play directly? So in relation to the first issue, we'd identified from previous studies by the ITU, for example, and a number of other bodies who had done some research in this area, where technological developments could enable carbon abatement. The sectors that that stood out as being the principal ones were electricity, obviously, transport, agriculture, and industry. We had as an agency somewhat of a little experience, I would say, between connectivity and the crossover with electricity. In 2019, we allocated some specific spectrum for use as part of smart grid planning. So we had a little bit of experience in that. But in relation to these sectors, we were kind of interested in understanding if we had identified the correct sectors, whether we had understood the relevance of connectivity, and whether anything could be said in terms of measurement. On the second issue, we were, what role does our sector, the telecommunications sector in particular, have to play as a direct contributor? We wanted to know if operators were measuring their emissions and whether they were taking footsteps to address it. Just a word on the consultation process. It was kind of an interesting one because many of the stakeholders that we encountered were not the usual stakeholders. We were used to dealing with telecommunications operators. Here we were dealing with some bodies, representative organizations, academic institutions, kind of working in the agriculture area, which is very important in Ireland, and in transport and in other areas. Many were quite happy to talk to us. A number of parties made written submissions, and they're available on our website if anybody wants to have a look at those. In terms of what our key takeaways were from the call for inputs, I would say respondents generally agreed with our take on what were the key sectors where connectivity had a role to play. And stakeholders in these sectors recognized increasingly the role that connectivity was playing. In particular, they mentioned the importance of the continued rollout of very high capacity networks as a facilitating factor, and the role that the IoT will play in the future. A third key takeaway for us was that the operators themselves were very keen to promote the benefits that their connectivity enables, but I would say that, you know, putting it mildly, the estimates of that kind of varied widely. One telecommunications operator who was referenced, you know, from the US, I think it was, talked about a factor of 2. Sorry, I've skipped ahead by accident. Another organization, European one, estimated that it was a factor of 3. And then another representative organization quoted a factor of 10 as an enabling factor. So, you know, to say the least, the estimates that are kind of widely vary. And I think what this points to is a kind of a lack of standardization of approaches to measuring these things, and that's something to work on. In terms of the direct impact that the operators would make, the first thing to say is many operators were taking steps to measure their own emissions. You know, they when measuring emissions, they pointed to network build, network operations, and back office operations as significant factors contributing to emissions. But again, emphasizing the interconnected nature of all the sectors that we're doing, everybody pointed towards the indirect emissions purchased, in particular purchased electricity, to power the networks as the largest component of the telecommunications footprint. Second takeaway in relation to measurement is that many are setting targets. For example, our incumbent operator quoted a target of 50% reduction by 2030, but you know, across the board the commitments were voluntary. An important takeaway for us as well is that operators making technology investments to improve efficiency see this as a way of reducing associated emissions. So, for example, the deployment of machine learning algorithms to optimize the use of radio spectrum to minimize energy consumption. That's an efficiency enhancing measure that has the consequence of reducing carbon footprint. So that's important, I think. Fourth takeaway for us was that respondents saw fiber rollout as delivering very significant efficiencies relative to the copper networks, and in particular pointed to the access networks as being a key driver of energy consumption. Overall, again, estimates varied very widely, but we're orders of magnitude of 40 to 60% energy savings as a result of deploying fiber on the networks. Across both categories, the deployment of very high capacity networks was seen as an enabling factor, as the most significant enabling factor. And this chimes, I think, with European policy in this area. Last year, BEREC started. BEREC is as I mentioned earlier, is the organization, European organization made up of national regulatory authorities in Europe, and BEREC has started to do some work in this area. BEREC's latest strategy, for example, mentions specifically issues relating to sustainability. And concrete steps have included establishing some working groups with some work streams associated with them. The objective of these is to understand the complicated nature of how the sector interacts with other sectors, and how do you tell the story around what contribution the sector can make. So BEREC and the NRAs they're experts in networks, and they're good position to develop an understanding on sustainability issues there. The significance of CapEx versus OpEx, access networks versus backhaul and core elements, mobile versus fixed, and so on. But really, is where do the networks integrate with the rest of the economy, and the services that they support? That's an important issue to try and get on top on. And a significant stat, I think, is that, ICT, there's lots of measurements out there, but one measurement is around 4% of global emissions of CO2 attributable to ICT. And the networks represent about a quarter of that, or so it's estimated. So what's BEREC done so far? So to get the ball rolling, last year BEREC had a kind of a series of workshops, and it has launched a study which is intended to review the literature in this area, create an opportunity to reach out to other stakeholders in this area, EU bodies, private operators, NGOs, and so on. And just a couple of weeks ago, BEREC had its kind of annual stakeholder event where it showcases its work program and advertises the consultation about what upcoming work is maybe on the table. The central topic at that was sustainability. Interestingly as well, expertise has one of the functions that BEREC does is to provide opinions to the European Commission when it's formulating legislation. And in the context of the BCRD, that's the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, there's a revision of that going on at the moment. The European Commission asked BEREC, consulted BEREC and asked their opinion on what was being proposed. And there were a set of questions there for the first time relating to the sustainability of the networks. So that's interesting, and it kind of underlines the importance for BEREC to develop it and the regulators to develop some capability in this area. Just to finish off, what's planned? Well, I think a lot hinges on what the outcome of this study that we have going on at the moment. I think that will allow the regulators and BEREC to see better what kind of contribution they can make to this debate. And just for information here, if anybody is still interested in making a comment on the work program that we might put together in this area, the consultation is actually still open. So I've included the contact details for that there. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Very, very interesting. So now for Nisarg.
Sincere apologies. I will try cutting my script a few minutes down to be in time. So firstly, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. And before I start speaking, I must start with a confession. I'm only an engineer, so I'm in a very esteemed company of regulators and economists. But I'm going to give you a view from a utility company's vantage point in terms of the lived reality of decarbonization and the transformation program as it comes through. Also, we are at a very early stage, and other speakers talked about it being at early stage. So I don't have a final answer. I'll share observation on what works and kind of what we have found to date. A short context on Scottish Water. We were formed in 2002 at a merger of 3 water companies. And at the time of formation, about 18 years ago, our performance was, well, poor, rather very poor. We were one of the highest charging water company in the UK and one of the lowest performing at the same time. Not a good position to be in. Fast forward 18 years and come 2020, we are one of the lowest charging in the industry with one of the highest performance in the industry. At the most recent survey, water sector in Scotland was rated highest trusted by customers among all other industries. And our operational carbon footprint over this period has reduced by about 45%, so just shy of half. So a remarkable transformation, one might say, and we certainly believe so. But underneath this remarkable transformation over the last 18 years, slight few simple construct. First is a singularity of view and a short-term focus per regulatory period. And a regulatory task list where we got given tasks and project and we had to do it over a certain period of time. And as long as we've done it, we were successful. And it has helped us till now, but dare I say, it's a very blinkered way of looking at a dynamically changing world in the modern future. And hence we've embarked on a second journey of transformation. Challenges for transformation at core, goes without saying, is decarbonization, right at the heart of it. We are committed to achieving net zero by 2040, 5 years ahead of Scottish Government's target of 2045. And our net zero plan is published on our website if anyone is interested to know more about it in detail. But this net zero ambition must be achieved in context of some of the other challenges we face. First, the perennial challenge of aging asset. Unlike some of the other sector, water industry, we've got a strong heritage. We've got assets going back to Queen Victoria's time, and some even before Queen Victoria's time. All of those assets need intervention and upgrades. And every £1 million of investment we put in ground, we increase our carbon footprint by about 300 tons. Currently, we drive just about £700 million of investment a year, and we expect to raise it to about £1 billion a year, which means our carbon footprint then increases. Also, there's a seismic shift in customer expectation. They're no longer willing to accept yesterday's service or a differential service between different industries. In past, I certainly know people would say, well, that's the kind of service you get from a watch company versus that's the kind of service you get from a telco versus the new world industries. Not anymore. Their expectations are continuously reshaped by new world industries, and we must catch up. And all of this is happening at the same time as continually reducing ability for customers to pay. And I do remember in some of the previous conversation, it did came around customers' ability to pay. Pandemic has done no favors, it's made it even worse. Deep-rooted challenges of inequality and a light speed pace of digitization. So any future transformation must be able to deal with this complex, multidimensional systemic change with net zero and decarbonization at heart. So any systemic problem needs a systemic solution. In our case, it started with our economic regulator, Water Industry Commissioner for Scotland, moving away from an adversarial 6-year checklist-based program to a longer-term ethical-based regulation. A system in which all parties come together to drive progress. It recognized the need for one long-term strategy for the industry, and it helps drive conversation on trade-off of choices we make. Because unfortunately, there are no longer simple answers around. Every choice we make would have some trade-offs. The changes in regulatory system may sound simple, but at core, it leads to deep-seated changes in the way we as utility company make decisions and the way we operate. We can no longer hide behind a regulatory task list and tell our customer we could only do X if it was in the technical expression, or if someone gave us money for it, we could do it. We need to be driven by long-term strategy and a clear purpose. And to do that, we're building what we're internally calling building new muscles, but on a plain speak, building new capacities and capabilities. One such capability we need to build is how we analyze and prioritize demand and explain it to our customers on why invest X over Y. Again, it's been talked previously in terms of would customers pay, but gone are the days where customer would simply accept an engineer, or dare I say even an economist or a regulator's view to say this is the right thing to do. Trust me, I'm an expert. We need to learn to articulate and explain to customers why we make choices we make. In past, the choices were made based on the lowest cash cost in the regulatory period. Then we moved on to the lowest whole life cost beyond regulatory period, and that is now becoming common practice. Now, when I say lowest whole life cost, I don't mean to say sticking some band-aid on certain asset is a bad idea, but it's just that any decision we make must be seen in a longer period, must be analyzed in the longer period. And ultimately, we need to make further shift from the lowest whole life cost to one which factors and monetize additional non-financial benefits and cost, whether it's carbon, whether it's service, whether it's biodiversity, or whether it's community benefit. These things don't come easy, and I'm sure many of you know. I see many academics in the room as well, and the research is continually taking place on how to do it. So we'll have to invent things as we go. There's a recognition from our economic regulator that in some instances, solutions of this nature, which takes into account all of the non-financial benefits as well, would require some additional funding, and there's a ring-fence allowance created to fund the delta between the best whole life cost solution and the solution which provides greatest value. But the key point is not funding. Funding is good, great, but the key point is how do we articulate that properly? How do we analyze that properly? And for that, we need new capabilities. But we also need to unlearn many of the past way of working and fundamentally redefine what success means for us as an engineers and us as an industry. And this needs to be done in context of shifting power balance between engineering and customers unit. To that end, we're striving, very early stage, but we're striving to create a world where customers and communities' views weighs as much as the views of engineering. And therein lies one of the dilemma, not just today's customer, but tomorrow's customer. And how do we achieve it? We don't know, but we are certainly trying. We're trying various approaches to it. So in summary, a systemic problem needs systemic solution. We've started by creating an open system which is driven by a long-term strategy and a clear understanding of trade-off led by our economic regulator. In response, we as a watch company are building new capabilities and capacity to move away from lowest whole life cost to the highest value solution, looking at all of the non-financial benefits in there and a new way of capital allocation. And all of this is done by ensuring customers and communities' view weigh as much as engineering view, a must for continually maintaining our social license to operate. Specifically on decarbonization, as I've said, we published our net zero roadmap. We've got a strong plan to achieve operational net zero by 2040. And we're working with the industry and academia to define a strong plan to achieve net zero and embodied carbon footprint from our investment. We're at a very early stage. Hope you found what I've said insightful. But at core, what we are trying to do is change the way we make decisions, the way we operate, and most importantly, the way as leader of the industry think. As we move away from the world where answers to the problem, historically, answers to most of our problems were known and only challenge was execution, to the world where we need to dynamically adapt because many of the answers we need are not yet found and we need to find them and then execute at pace. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nisarg. Very, very interesting speech. I just to relate to what you just said on non-financial benefits and items. As a regulator myself, I just struggle with that. And the only tool I know is just to put some kind of incentive, financial incentive, we know all of regulators know incentive regulation, and just to set a goal because that is not a natural goal for the operator, and then put some money on it and incentivize the operators on that. So do you have, all of you, do you have other ideas on that?
Is that a question of me?
Yeah, or any of you?
Do we have ideas? Someone did ask me before, and the honest answer is I always have ideas. It's just many of them are wrong.
Any good ideas?
In fact, our economic and regulator is also in the conference. So David, do raise your hand if you want to add something to it. So certainly around carbon, the world is advancing rapidly. So it's easier to monetize carbon and put something in it. There's been conversation on it.
Yes.
The challenges come when we look at the community benefit and how do you weigh that in. We're working on different approaches, a softer approach at this point to try rather than even just arbitrary on a ranking that on a scale of 1 to 10. And how does one weigh against another? But it's a very early stage. The key point is having that as an ambition and defining it one at a time. So on carbon, our thinking is more advanced. On community benefit, thinking is very nascent. On biodiversity is even further nascent at this point in time.
Thanks very much. Well, otherwise, I was very interested by what John said on the ICT sector regarding the enabling capacity of this sector, which look like common sense, obviously, because you just avoid some transport for people, etc., etc. But what I see, for instance, in the public debate in my country, in France, well, we have very, very scary announcements regarding the CO2 impact of telecoms, for instance. You see even some state agencies just warning, be careful with your emails. Each time you send an email, it's like you drive a few kilometers with your car. things like that. And so I think the discourse, what you said about the enabling capacity was just refreshing and kind of interesting for me. But going to questions for all of you. What do you think of coercive measures? Like we can see sometimes in France, because sometimes, for example, what is discussed is to quite forbid any transport when there is a high-speed train doing the same travel for less than 2 hours, for instance. So this kind of coercive measure, do you think that's efficient and we should go towards this direction or not, for instance, Waishan? Have you ideas on that?
Yeah, so if I understood your question correctly, it's about the cost of infrastructure. Is that
no? It's about some kind of coercive measures. I mean some kind of interdiction of some air travel, for instance, when the distance is quite small, thing like that. As for passengers.
Yeah, so in terms of the transport sector, I think we need to look at it from a systematic point of view. So looking at the entire system as well, and what will be the most efficient mode for different trip purpose, different distance, or even different time of the day when that trip is being made. So to really increase the efficiency of the sector and to encourage multimodal transport. So not just focusing on, say, rail investment, but also looking at how that could be connected with other types of public transport and how that could actually be supplemented by some of the new emerging services that we have also seen. And so in a nutshell, it's really about increasing and improving the efficiency of the sector.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much first to all the speakers, and thank you very much, Dominique, for having managed this conference despite the many technical incidents we witnessed. Let me first try to say a few words. Of course, I think it was very stimulating to have the two keynotes at the beginning that highlighted both not only the complexity but also the magnitude of the problem to be solved, and it was also reminded by many of the speakers today. And basically, they both call for a kind of system approach of the issue, which means that within a given sector, all the interdependencies have to be taken into account, but also the interdependency across sectors have to be taken into account. This also lead to consider the tools that are available in use. There are no silver bullet. The ETS system typically is a good way to manage decarbonification, but as it was highlighted by the first speaker, by Simone, there are many missing markets there, and so it means that there are many complementary tools that have to be taken into account. But in addition, so typically taxes and quotas can be also taken into consideration. But since we have this question of sector coupling and industry coupling or modes coupling within a sector, we have to consider all the externalities that are there and that lead to market failures, and then to need for intervention of regulators. This interconnection among the issues and the problem and the sectors have to be also considered extensively. So we have externalities everywhere. We have positive externalities, that it was reminded by Patrice Geoffron. and we have a lot of negative externalities, of course. And here is the role of ICTs, of digital technologies, is crucial. Because the digital technologies, as it has been pointed out at some occasions, they can contribute to modify the behavior of users. Of course, tariffs are a good way to modify their behaviors, but the digital technologies can automatically make decisions for them and or frame their decision. Digital technologies are also useful to interconnect the various markets, to manage the trade-offs that the various players have to do across markets. And of course, digital technologies are the only technologies that enable individuals and organizations and communities to consider all those interdependence that were highlighted all along this session today. So of course, those technologies are crucial. I think in addition, there is something which is important, which is linked to one of the comments you made at some point, Dominique, saying, well, as regulator, we have only the market tools, the economic tools to impact on behaviors. That I'm not sure it's so true, because in fact, for the last decade, many regulators develop strategies to communicate, to collect information, to gather information from the industry, and to provide this information to the public. And better informing the public and the users and the consumers is a good way to modify behavior. This is, for instance, relied upon by many regulators in the transportation industry, and this is also increasingly used by other type of regulator. And we made the session, the NER session this week, organized by the OECD, was organized around the question of measuring the performance of regulators. I think that one of the channels through which the regulator could increase their impact is through this soft tool of communication to the users, even if we know that users are not modifying their behavior so easily. But again, information technologies, digital technologies can contribute to modify their behavior. So I will stop there because time is more than over. I would like again to thank all the participants to this meeting, the contributors from the academia, from the regulators, from the intergovernmental organization, and from the industry. I would like also to mention the Network of Economic Regulators Secretariat, and in particular Anna Petikanen and Alex Durand, who basically were very active in organizing this conference today, together with Marie-Hélène Kaitukoli from the Governance and Regulation Chair at Paris Dauphine, who is managing the Secretariat of the Club des Régulateurs. This is again a successful cooperation between the Network of Economic Regulators and the Club des Régulateurs. Dominique, you are the president of the Club des Régulateurs, so thank you both for having chaired this session and for having enabled the club to co-organize with the OECD this conference. So thank you very much, Dominique.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much all speakers and the audience. Thanks.